Hello, my name is Wyatt Slocum, and today I'll be talking to you about the ecological effects of ocean acidification. So, first, we'll talk about what is ocean acidification. Then, we'll discuss why it matters to us. We'll discuss the current ocean pH levels and the projected future pH levels. We'll talk about the effect on marine life and the marine habitats. We'll dive into an experiment observing lobsters in Maine and how they react to both acidic water and warm acidic water. Then we'll kind of recap and go over the take-home messages from this presentation. So first, what is ocean acidification? Well, CO2 from the atmosphere goes into the ocean and mixes with the water, and through a series of chemical reactions, it forms carbonic acid, which is here on the left. It's the H2CO3. So ocean acidification, by definition, is the sustained decrease in pH of the ocean water. So just to go into the pH scale a little bit, anything below a 7 on the pH scale, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, is acidic. Anything above that, 8, 7.1 all the way to 14 is basic. And so an acidic water would be anything below 7. So in the ocean, we have carbon dioxide that mixes with the water, and that creates carbonic acid, but it doesn't stay as carbonic acid. It reacts with different bases in the water, one of which is carbonate. We'll discuss more about the uses of carbonate with other sea creatures in the environment, but carbonate is a base that reacts with the carbonic acid and neutralizes the acid. And you can see on the right side of the picture there, the carbonate mixes with the carbonic acid and creates bicarbonate. And it's not just a little bit of the CO2 that goes into the ocean. Actually, 30% of atmospheric carbon dioxide goes into the ocean. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but the ocean is known as a carbon sink, and that's just due to the fact that it absorbs so much carbon. So I just mentioned it, but the ocean is a carbon sink. What this means is that carbon from the atmosphere goes into the ocean, and most of it never comes back out. You can see by the picture on the right that carbon dioxide goes into the water. You see a very small arrow goes back into the atmosphere. That's just the water evaporating and bringing some CO2 with it. Most of the carbon dioxide gets dissolved into the water, absorbed by phytoplankton through photosynthesis, or plankton use the carbon, which I discussed earlier, gets mixed with the carbonate to create bicarbonate. So some of that carbonate goes into the plankton. They use it to create kind of a hard shell, protective shell. But once the plankton die, or they fix the CO2, or the carbon itself just stays in the water, it usually sinks down with the rest of the organic matter, goes to the bottom of the ocean where it stays, and then after thousands of years, it gets compressed and more stuff gets piled on top, and after a long time, it turns into fossil fuels. So there's a lot of carbon dioxide that goes into the ocean and never comes out. This is the way it's always been, but due to increased carbon outputs, we're seeing kind of a change in the pH levels of ocean, more carbon's going in, and this is kind of affecting the dynamics of the ocean. So why does the pH level of the ocean, the carbon dioxide absorption. Why does this matter to us? Well, you can see some of these pictures here on the left is it's called coral bleaching. What happens, coral is it's an organism, it's a very small organism, and the actual structure you see is made of carbonate, this kind of a hard backbone for them. But when the water gets too warm, the actual organism leaves the hard backbone. So what's left is this white, chalky carbonate structure that's left behind. And if the water stays too warm or too acidic, the coral itself just dies. So this, destroys the habitat for lots of fish and many other creatures that live in coral reefs. Here in the middle, you see several fishermen. So the pH and the high levels of carbon in the water, when it's, pH is lower than usual, carbon's higher than usual, it can affect the way fish develop. There were studies that show that it makes their ears, their kind of hearing mechanism develops larger than usual, so they're not able to hear some of the sound waves that other fish would be able to hear. This makes it easier for predators to kind of catch them and eat them, and makes the supply lower. Fishermen can't catch them as readily. Also, here on the far right, you see algae blooms, algal blooms. When there's increased carbon in the water, this makes it easier for plankton and other algae to photosynthesize, create their hard structure shells, and it makes for these very large algae blooms, which can be seen from space. It looks cool from space, but it's actually not good for the environment at all. What happens is as the algae absorb all this CO2, it creates kind of a oxygen deprived environment around the algae. And so this is where, fish kind of suffocate. There's good algae, and then there's some algae which is just poisonous to fish. So all the algae thrive in this type of environment, making it, just a bad place for most marine life. And I mentioned earlier in the middle picture that the fishermen aren't able to catch as many fish. This also goes for clams. It's harder for them to reproduce and grow. Lobsters, oysters, many marine creatures that people depend on for food. It's harder for them to thrive in this type of environment. Harder for fishermen to catch, and this affects the economies of many nations that rely heavily on an ocean-based economy. Many people depend solely on ocean proteins like fish and clams for their diet. So this affects their economies. They're not able to make money, and they're not able to eat oftentimes. Very big deal. To move on, this chart here on the right kind of shows past projections here. Starting at 1960, this is just when technology kind of developed in a way to where we could measure atmospheric carbon and saltwater carbon levels, as well as the pH and the particles of CO2 in the water. But you can imagine that the chart goes back, hundreds of years, and based off this trend, it's going to be a lot lower. So we kind of realize that some people say CO2 goes on this up and down natural scale. It's just a cycle that the Earth goes through, which may or may not be true, but we do know that humans have been emitting extra carbon into the atmosphere since the beginning of the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. We've been burning more fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, and this has increased the CO2 in the atmosphere. So with increased CO2 in the atmosphere, we learned earlier, 30% of that goes into the ocean. So that means more CO2 in the water. And you can see in this graph, this dark blue line kind of near the top is the CO2 that's in the water. The maroon one above it is CO2 in the atmosphere. So those two are pretty much directly correlated. So more in the atmosphere equals more CO2 in the water. And then the light blue line below it shows the saltwater pH. So more CO2 in the water, lower pH. Lower pH, more acidic. So we can see as there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, the pH is lower, the water is more acidic. And the next slide, these are future projections for what the ocean may look like pH-wise. Research these, I'll explain first the graphs, then I'll go into more detail. This top one here is the pH of the ocean. So the black dots here on the left side of the top graph are historic pH levels. The gray ones, these gray squares that come off to the right, those are if we kind of curbed our CO2 emissions and started maybe absorbing some CO2 from the atmosphere, reversing the damage we've done. The blue triangles are if we completely stopped emitting CO2 in the atmosphere. The teal squares coming off are if we just continue doing exactly what we're doing right now, no increase, just continue doing. This is based off the year 2000. If in the year 2000 we kept emitting the same amount of CO2, that's what the trend would look like. The red circles are more of we're on this increasing rate of CO2 emissions. This is what it's going to look like if we continue that rate, that trajectory. We keep emitting more and more and more CO2. That's what the pH is going to look like. Then the bottom graph is like a concentration of protons. So as you know, acids, by definition, release protons and bases accept protons. So as there's more acid in the water, there's going to be more protons. This graph on the bottom shows essentially the same thing with the gray squares representing a curving or an extreme decrease in emissions. The dark blue triangles are if we just stop. The teal squares are if we continue what we're doing right now. And the red circles are if we continue increasing our rate of emissions. So based off these charts and off several predictions, the pH levels of the ocean will reach about 7.8 by 2100, the end of the century. And this is a decrease from 8.2 pH, which is fairly basic, and 7.8 isn't, extremely acidic, but it is enough to devastate marine life and marine habitats. These decreases in pH are almost unavoidable at this point unless we devise some technology to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. It doesn't seem very feasible to completely stop emitting CO2 from fossil fuels, from cars or factories or other production. So at this point, we're just going to keep emitting CO2, but we're going to have to decrease what we're doing. Many experts think that the ocean will just be a lot more acidic in the future. It's going to be about 7.8 pH. But if we do take measures and we do kind of cut back on our CO2 emissions, it might be able to help with that and decrease its effect. So let's talk more about marine life and habitats. Crustaceans and corals use carbonate, which we mentioned earlier is a base that counteracts the carbonic acid. They use this carbonate to make their shells. They fix calcium with the carbonate to create a hard structure that supports and protects their bodies. Both the crustaceans and the corals use this carbonate. So when there's more carbon dioxide, there's more carbon dioxide mixing with the water, creating carbonic acid. More carbonic acid mixes with the carbonate ions, and there's less carbonate ions available for these creatures to use for their shells and for their structures. Plankton also fix CO2 and bicarbonate, which is the product of carbonate ion and carbonic acid. They use this for photosynthesis, and this decreases the oxygen levels of the water. As I mentioned earlier, in this middle picture, you can kind of see this algae bloom from space. It's very massive. All that area in very dark green is algae, and you can imagine those are oxygen deprived areas where it's very hard for fish to thrive. There's increased acidity that harms fish. As I mentioned earlier, it affects their development, affects the way they resist predators, and it also affects their environment. It gets rid of the coral reefs, which they use for protection, and deprives them of oxygen from the algae blooms. So let's talk about this experiment. It's called American Lobster Post-Larvae Gene Regulation in Response to Ocean Warming and Acidification. So what they did in this experiment, they were in the Port of Maine, and they took these lobsters from the surrounding environment. They raised them, and once they're in this third larvae stage, which is a very important stage right before they become adults, it's kind of a choke point. That's why they chose this third larvae stage. They put them in different environments. This first one here you can see in the graph, it's the top one, top row, 400 parts per million of CO2 at 16 degrees Celsius is their natural environment. This is kind of a control, that top row. They have the temperature, salinity of the water, the pH of the water, the calcium, and the argonite. This is kind of like acidity and different molecules in the water that are affected by acidity. The row below it shows a increased level of carbon in the water. The row below that, second to the bottom, has a controlled carbon, but a high temperature of 19 degrees Celsius. Then the last row has increased carbon in the water and increased temperature. What they did is they had 3 of these post-larvae lobsters in each of the environments. They kept them in there for 48 hours each, rinsed them, cleaned them, then they extracted the DNA, sent it off to a lab, and compared it to natural healthy lobsters to see if the genes for immune system and the genes for shell development were affected by the different environments. Here are some figures from the graphs. This top one here shows the lobsters that were in the elevated temperature environment. It shows the red dots on the left are down regulations in genes affecting shell formation and immune system. The green dots show the up regulation in immune system and shell development genes. So it was slightly affected by the environment of high temperature. The one below that in the middle, you can see there's a large amount of upregulation in shell formation and immune system because of the high concentration of carbon in the water. but the downregulation is about the same as high temperature. On the last row, you see lobsters exposed to high temperature and high carbon levels. Red dots are downregulation, green dots are upregulation. This is the most dramatic effect that we've seen on the genes throughout the study. We can see the combination of both factors really affects the way these lobsters develop. The results from this study here on the right might be a little difficult to see. There are red lines, green lines, and then just black spaces. The red lines represent a down regulation in genes, green lines are up regulation, and then black line is no change. So here on the left side are the temperature, the lobsters that were exposed to high temperature environments. You see a lot of down regulation and a little bit of up regulation. In the middle is high carbon lobsters, and you see high levels of upregulation and a decent amount of downregulation. And then on the far right, you see high temperature and high carbon levels, and that this is the most upregulation and the most downregulation from all lobsters. So what they kind of learned from this study is that lobsters that are exposed to environment with both high CO2 levels and high temperature levels are greatly affected in the way they develop. Their bodies have to react different in order to survive. They have to regulate genes differently, produce shells in a different way, and develop their immune system in a different way. But we do note that high carbon levels alone also affect these lobsters in a great way. So for the take-home messages, we see atmospheric carbon dioxide reacts with water, and it creates this carbonic acid, which then reacts with the buffers in the water, which can take away carbonate ions from crustaceans such as crabs and clams and oysters and corals, and that can kind of destroy their lives and their environment. Then we see that high CO2 levels lowers the pH of the water, making it more acidic and harmful to ocean environment and creatures. Ocean animals must adapt to a lower pH, as we saw in the study with the lobsters, or they could die. And if current CO2 absorption trend does not change, all life, both on land and in the ocean, will be greatly affected as the environment is altered. Many creatures may die, and the economy, people on Earth will not be the same. Here are my references, and thank you guys for watching.